My life didn't end the day my mother passed away, but something inside me shattered 40 days later, when my father presented me with a proposal that shook all my certainties. In that moment, he distorted the word I loved to justify something that seemed impossible to accept. When I said no, I was surrounded not only by his rejection, but also by family members who told me my faith compelled me to compromise. I stood there, caught between the fear of losing myself completely and the desire to break free. It was like being caught between two worlds, either surrender completely and erase myself, or run away and leave behind everything I knew. This is the story of how I found the strength to escape the darkness, how small signs of hope emerged when all seemed lost, and how I walked away from a religion that imprisoned me to finally find life again. This story may not appeal to everyone, but I believe it needs to be heard. If you feel these truths are important, stay with me, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. This helps give a voice to those who have the courage to speak out. Now, come back with me to the beginning. My journey began in a home that I thought was the safest place in the world. My father, with his firm figure, drew the boundaries of my universe. For a long time, I never even considered crossing them. These boundaries were drawn with the sacred words of the Quran and colored by the obedience that seemed natural to me. Our little world revolved around that simple red brick house in Manchester, always under the watchful eye of the neighborhood. On that quiet street, the muezzin's shadow in the late afternoon was like a silent reminder of our belonging, of what was expected of us. Back then, I saw that shadow as protection, not a prison. Life in our home had its own rhythm, marked by the 5 daily calls to prayer. When the call sounded, everything around us seemed to stop. The scent of my mother's cardamom tea gave way to the clean, earthy aroma of the prayer rug. We lined up behind my father, Imam Hassan, who stood firm as a rock. His voice, as he recited the verses, was deep, strong, ancient, a powerful current that carried us forward with no room for questions. I loved that voice. It was the voice of security, of absolute truth. He wasn't just my father. He was the compass of our community. Everyone came to him with their problems, their doubts, their hopes. And I, his daughter, was supposed to be the perfect reflection of that faith, the obedient daughter, the good girl. My mother, Samira, was different. If my father was the structure, she was the heart that gave life to it all. Silent, delicate, she never needed to raise her voice to express her love. I felt it in her cool, gentle hands, always adjusting my hijab with a calm smile, in the clothes she folded carefully, in the meals that tasted like home, and in the soft scent of rosewater that enveloped her. She taught me that a woman's true strength lay in her calm, her quiet patience, her ability to be a safe haven in a world dominated by men. I believed this wholeheartedly. Her universe was my universe, illuminated by a soft, gentle light. Was I happy? Perhaps so. Or at least, I was at peace with my role, with the destiny I'd been given. I knew exactly what to say, how to act, and I did it with the sincere dedication of a child who only wants to win her parents' smiles of approval. But sometimes, when I looked out my bedroom window, I saw the other girls in the neighborhood, English, free, in colorful coats, their hair loose and dancing in the wind, laughing loudly and fearlessly. Their voices cut through the gray Manchester air with a joy so different from my own. I felt a hint of something there, not exactly envy, but a curiosity that nagged at me. What were their lives like? What were they talking so loudly about? They seemed to live in a world without borders, full of vibrant colors, messy and unpredictable, so different from the straight lines and rigid rules that delimited mine. Quickly, I would close the curtain, feeling a strange guilt wash over me, and pick up my rosary. The cool, soft touch of the beads glided through my fingers, bringing comfort, a return to what I knew, to what was safe. My world was small, yes, but it felt complete. It was perfect. I couldn't imagine living any other way, and certainly not without the two pillars that held it all together, my father's firm authority and my mother's gentle, constant love. And then everything changed with something so simple, the smell of burnt toast. My mother, Samira, had stepped away for a moment to answer the phone, and her soft laughter still echoed through the hallway. I was sitting at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly drawing on the oilcloth, half listening to what was happening. That was the last time I heard her laughter. The moments that followed were a blur, a fragmented nightmare. A phone falling to the floor, a teacup shattering, and then my father's scream. a sound I'd never heard before, harsh, deep, desperate, ripping through the morning silence. My world, which I'd carefully mapped out, didn't just shatter, it shattered into pieces. In the days that followed, our once quiet and spacious home became a crowded and noisy place. Women I barely knew would gently stroke my hair, murmuring, "It is Allah's will." These words buzzed around me, insistent and suffocating. Men filled my father's office, their voices blending into a low, heavy murmur, like a constant prayer. They brought food, piles of plates piled high with rice and lamb, which I couldn't even touch. The house, my safe haven, seemed to be sinking into a sea of sadness and anticipation. The smell of food made me nauseous. It felt like my stomach wanted to escape from that place. I felt like a ghost in my own home, wandering through rooms filled with the pain of others, but where I no longer had a place. The rituals that once brought comfort now felt empty, as if they were just a performance for a strange audience I neither recognized nor understood. Where did that soul go that, minutes before, laughed at a piece of burnt toast? In an instant, it became a prayer, a memory, an empty space on the prayer rug that once welcomed it. But the true destruction only began when the last visitor left. The front door closed with a sharp click, and a heavy, strange silence filled the house. It wasn't the peaceful, tranquil silence I knew. This silence had weight, like an invisible wall squeezing my chest and stealing my breath. I was there, in the empty chair at the dining table, in the scent of rose water that had faded from the pillows. I was in the kitchen, still clean, because no one was messing with flour or spices anymore. The rhythm of our lives had simply vanished. The cadence that once guided our days had been shattered. The house had lost its soul, and so had my father. In his own way, the strong, steady river of his voice suddenly froze. He no longer spoke to me about her, no longer held me. His grief became a cold, closed fortress that shut me out. He prayed with a new and frightening fervor, prostrating himself for hours, his fingers white and clenched on his rosary. The words were the same, but the melody that had comforted me was gone. Now his voice sounded like a man trying to bargain with an unresponsive God. Sometimes he'd stare at me from across the dinner table, in the silence of the house. His eyes were different, empty, distant. It was as if he were looking right through me, as if I were a painful memory, a piece of that life he wanted to forget. The shadow that once protected me, the long shadow of our world, suddenly felt like a prison. It was no longer a shield, it was the cold wall of a tomb. And in that oppressive silence, left by my mother's absence, an icy fear began to grow within me. The silence stretched on for 40 days, a mourning that felt like an eternity. It became a fragile, invisible layer covering our lives, and I was afraid to make any sudden movement that would tear it, exposing the gaping wound beneath. Then, one night, my father made this move. He called me into his office. It was a rare occurrence, almost impossible after my mother's death. That room, once the heart of our spiritual and intellectual life, became his private sanctuary for mourning. I hadn't been back inside since the day of the funeral. The air was heavy, filled with the smell of old books, mixed with something cold and empty that had never been there before. He sat behind the large oak desk, the Quran open in front of him, but his eyes weren't on it. They were fixed on his hands resting on his bladder. He didn't even offer to sit. Out of nowhere, he began to speak. His voice was strangely measured, too calm, as if he were preaching to an empty mosque. He spoke of the fragility of life, of the need to restore the honor and sanctity of a shattered family. He spoke of me, of the uncertain future of a young woman alone, without the protection of a mother or a complete home. I just nodded, staring at a crack in the ceiling, wishing it would all be over. It felt like a lecture, distant and lifeless. But then the lecture took a dark turn, something I never could have imagined. He said he had sought a sign from Allah, prayed for guidance, and that this sign had come. In a dream, he said, my mother appeared, worried about me, her unprotected daughter. She had begged him to do his duty. And what was that duty? He looked me in the eyes for the first time that night, eyes burning with feverish pity, and said that his duty was to take me as his wife, to place me under his protection in the most complete and sacred way possible. The words hung in the air like something monstrous, impossible to accept. My mind simply couldn't process them. It was as if he were speaking a strange language, full of meaningless sounds. Wife, me, him. The room seemed to tilt, the crack in the ceiling widening as if it wanted to split the house in half. A wave of nausea washed over me, cold and sharp. That man, the pillar of my faith, whose voice I had always considered a safe and deep river, now spoke the most unthinkable thing. That river had turned into a dirty current, trying to drag me under. He continued, weaving together twisted verses and clumsy logic, citing obscure passages to justify this horror, framing it all as a sacred act, a way to preserve what was left of the family. He wasn't just a grieving father, he was a predator in disguise. All that pity, the respected authority, the map of my world he'd so carefully drawn, it was a huge, suffocating, monstrous lie. I took a step back, my hand covering my mouth to stifle a scream that wanted to escape. The only sound in the room was his calm, insane voice, and the frantic thump of my heart, pounding against my ribs as if it wanted to escape. But I didn't run out of the office. I backed away slowly, each step considered, my eyes fixed on his. It wasn't my father I saw anymore. It was a stranger with his face, a cold mask, too calm, a pity that chilled my blood. When I reached my room, I turned the key in the lock. The small click echoed in the immense silence of the house. That sound was my first act of rebellion. I spent hours sitting on the floor, my back against the door, listening. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the pipes, felt like he was approaching to end the conversation, to demand an answer. The house was no longer a home. It had become a prison, and the man downstairs was my jailer. The truth settled inside me, not as a shock, but as a deathly calm. There would be no argument against the madness that had taken over the house since my mother left. I had to leave. It wasn't a choice. It was a biological necessity, as urgent as breathing. The hardest part would be waiting. I waited for the rhythm of the house to adjust to this strange, irregular new pattern. I heard his footsteps downstairs, the clink of a glass, the murmur of the television. Finally, the sound of him coming up the stairs, pausing beside my door for a moment that felt like an eternity, before heading to his own room. Only then did I move. My movements were natural, instinctive, as if I were watching someone else act. I grabbed a canvas bag from my closet, the same one I used to carry my college books. First, the money, not much from birthday presents kept in a shoebox, my documents, my passport. I grabbed the first hijab I could find, a simple black one, and then my hand hesitated over my mother's jewelry box. I couldn't take everything. It would be like plundering a sacred tomb. I took only one thing, a silver locket she always wore, its surface worn from constant touching. I pressed the cool metal into my palm. It was a real piece of the woman I'd lost, not the distorted memory he'd tried to use against me. Leaving my room was like crossing enemy territory. Every floorboard, familiar to me all my life, felt like a traitor ready to betray my escape. I moved silently, a ghost within my own story. The air seemed to trap my breath in my chest. The most terrifying moment was passing his office. The half-open door let out a dark shadow that seemed to breathe in the hallway. I felt the weight of the words spoken in that room, like a foul odor that wouldn't leave the air, clinging to my skin and soul. My hand trembled as I reached for the front door, fingers stuttering until I found the lock. The final turn of the key was the loudest sound I'd ever heard, a click that seemed to shatter years of suffocating silence. When I opened the door, the night air hit me like a punch to the chest. Cold, damp, smelling of wet asphalt and something I could only call freedom. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, feeling like a ship casting out onto a dark, directionless sea, without a map, without a compass. The shadow of the minuet, that shadow that had been my shield for so long, was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the night. For the first time, I was truly alone. No shield, no protection, just me and the void before me. Fear tightened my throat, but I held it back. There was a destination, a small, flickering, but real light in the midst of that crushing darkness. My Aunt Jamila's house. She was my mother's sister, the only one who could understand me, the only one who had to understand me. I pulled my hijab tighter around my face, turned my back on the only home I'd ever had, and ran. Running through the silent streets of Manchester was like entering a strange land, an alien landscape. The city I knew from buses and daytime walks, full of life and sounds, now seemed a place made only of long, menacing shadows and the distant hum of cars. Every passing vehicle made me feel like it was hunting me. Every figure leaning against a doorway was a threat. My chest burned. A sharp pain in my side begged me to stop. But the image of him in that office, His calm gaze, his cruel possession, hurt much more. I gripped the strap of my bag tightly, feeling the silver medallion in my pocket, cool against my hip, an anchor amidst the chaos. And then, there it was. The small single-story house with the blue door and the rose bushes my Aunt Jamila loved so much. A fierce, desperate hope gripped me, giving my tired legs one last burst of energy. She opened the door, dressed in a nightgown, her face dazed, still sleepy, but quickly changed to one of alarm when she saw me huddled there like a frightened animal. But soon that expression softened, and I interpreted it as compassion. She pulled me inside, into the familiar warmth of that house that smelled of jasmine and clean clothes. She made me tea, caressed my trembling hands, and for a brief moment, I felt safe. I thought to myself, this is it. I'm safe. She's my mother's sister. She'll protect me. Then the torrent of words came out, fast, jumbled, urgent, as if I needed to release everything I'd been holding in for so long. I tried to open my heart in that house, to tell her everything I was going through, my studies, my dreams, his proposal, that look that froze my soul. The tears flowed uncontrollably, stifled by shame and fear I could barely put into words. I just wanted her to understand, to know what was happening to me. But as I spoke, something changed in her face. The confusion and compassion I'd seen before were transformed into something cold and distant. She stopped preparing the tea, sat down across from me, and her posture stiffened, almost as if I were a child who'd lost her mind. When I finished, expecting a hug, a word of comfort, she offered none. Instead, she let out a long, weary sigh of disappointment. "Lila," she said, her voice firm, too firm, like it cut through the air, "you're misunderstanding everything. Your father is going through a difficult time. He's a man of God, a good man. He just wants to protect you." Her words fell on me like shards of ice digging into my chest. "Protect?" I whispered, my voice catching in my throat, but she wasn't even looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on something above my head, an old framed script, with familiar letters, reminding me of the life I was trying to leave behind. "It is a daughter's duty to obey," she continued, her voice now firm and unwavering, reciting that teaching like a sentence. "Especially when your father is suffering, you must be patient. You cannot bring shame to our family by running away in the middle of the night as if you were an ordinary person." What she didn't say was as clear as what she did say. The door to my last refuge had just closed in my face, locked from the inside. She stood, dismissing me without so much as a look of hope, telling me without words that I should return to this prison they called home. I looked at her, at that face so similar to my mother's, and all I found was coldness. She wasn't the woman I loved. She was another guardian of my chain. The betrayal was so profound there was no room for tears, only a frozen emptiness. I turned and walked out the blue door. The night, which I had once dreaded, was now my only companion. I walked the silent streets of Manchester until dawn, aimless, hopeless. The shop shutters creaked, the buses cut through the cold air, and people awoke to their normal lives, so far removed from mine. I was a ghost, hidden under my black hijab, shrouded in a cloud of despair and loneliness. When my aunt's door closed, the energy from the leak faded. All that remained was exhaustion, a heavy body, a broken heart. I sat on an empty park bench, huddled in on myself, my mother's silver locket clutched in my hand, the only thing that felt real in that crumbling world. I watched my breath form little clouds in the freezing air, and I wondered if there was a way I could disappear, vanish into the Manchester fog and leave it all behind. That's when I heard a voice. "Ma'am, are you okay?" The voice was that of a police officer, filled with careful concern that immediately made me tense. In my life, authority figures have always been the subject of fear and obedience, and my first instinct was that she was there to take me back. I must have looked like prey ready to flee, because suddenly, her expression softened. "You seem paralyzed. Is there somewhere to go?" I could only shake my head, a stiff, almost automatic movement. She didn't ask me about my story, didn't want to know who I was running from or why. Instead, she pulled a pen and notebook from her pocket, scribbled something quickly on a sheet of paper, and placed the paper in my hands. "It's a women's shelter," she said in a low, gentle voice. "They're good people. They offer a hot drink and a place to think." With a professional nod, she walked away, leaving me there, clutching that little piece of paper like a lucky charm. It took me almost an hour to work up the courage to go there. The building was inconspicuous, a simple brick facade squeezed between a laundromat and a shop with boarded-up windows. It had no imposing gate or shiny sign, just a small doorbell. Pressing it was like admitting to myself that I had failed, that I was truly alone, lost. The door opened to a woman named Sarah. Her tired but kind eyes made me feel, for the first time, that maybe I wasn't completely invisible. She had red hair pulled back in a messy bun, and led me into a small office that smelled of coffee and old paper. The questions she asked weren't the ones I'd feared. Nothing about my father, or anything that might judge me. She just wanted to know if I was hurt, if I'd eaten, if I needed a place to sleep. I answered briefly, my voice a hoarse, fragile thread. I told her my first name, keeping my last name as a last shield against the world. I expected a lecture, a rebuke, any kind of condemnation, but none of it came. She just listened, jotting down the few details I gave on the computer. "Okay, Illa," she said finally, handing me a key attached to a plastic tag. "This is yours, room 7. She explained the simple rules, meals at the right times, trying to get enough rest. I followed Sarah down a hallway that smelled of disinfectant, past several identical doors. When she pointed to mine, she left me alone. I entered the small, simple room, a single bed with clean blankets, a modest desk, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. There was a lock on the door. I turned the key and heard the sweetest click I'd ever heard. It wasn't locking me out, it was locking me in. I slid to the floor, my back against the door, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I let the tears fall. The first few days at the Bridge of Hope were a blur of sleep and silence, a place where I was beginning to understand that I might, perhaps, one day rise again. I slept for hours and hours, sometimes up to 16 hours at a time, as if my body and soul needed a deep, silent hibernation. Sarah left food outside the door. I ate, but it was as if the taste had vanished from the world. My universe shrank to the 4 walls of my small, safe room. But when the physical exhaustion finally subsided, another kind of torment arose. The silence that had once been comforting now became fertile ground for doubt. My aunt's words echoed relentlessly in my mind. "You've got it all wrong. You're bringing shame to the family. This is your test." Had I really overreacted? Was my father simply a man broken by grief? And I, a cruel daughter for running away? Guilt weighed like a stone on my chest, pulling me back into that ancient gravity, into the orbit of what I believed to be true, the truth that trapped me, telling me I was the one in the wrong. At the shelter, there was an old computer in the common room that all the women used. For days, I avoided sitting there, afraid of what I might discover, or worse, of being seen. But the anguish of uncertainty was greater than the fear. One quiet afternoon, when no one was around, I sat in front of the screen, my hands trembling. I didn't even know what to search for. I just started typing the question that was pounding in my head. A daughter's duty to obey her father, Islam. The results came as I feared. Articles and fatwas, cold opinions that reaffirmed everything my aunt had said, tightening the bars of my invisible prison even further. Despair tightened my chest, almost suffocating. But then, as I scrolled down the page, a different title caught my eye. It wasn't an academic text, nor a formal lesson. It was simple and straightforward. I had escaped that pious family. My heart raced as I clicked, slipping on a tangled pair of headphones I'd found in a lost and found box. On the screen, an older woman spoke with eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and kindness. She wasn't angry, nor was she desperate. She spoke calmly, telling a story that wasn't my own, but one that seemed woven from the same invisible thread. She spoke of love tied to obedience, of sacred texts wielded as weapons, of the crushing weight of family honor, and the cruel fear of rejection. She spoke of the profound loneliness we feel when those who should protect us actually become the ones who imprison us. Each word was a sigh of relief, a silent embrace for my soul. I wasn't alone. That video was a key. It opened a door to a world I never knew existed, a world where my pain had a voice, and where I could begin to find myself. I spent hours, entire days, huddled before that bright screen, immersed in a labyrinth of forums, blogs, and secret groups, where women from all over the world shared their stories. Anonymous names hid faces marked by pain, while their typed voices echoed in the digital darkness. Stories of forced marriages, of abandoning faith, of cruel rejection by their own families. Their pain mirrored my own. Their questions were my deepest doubts. Little by little, The suffocating guilt that gripped me began to dissipate, giving way to a slow, burning anger that cleared my mind. My father wasn't speaking for God. He was using his words to uphold a system of control made by men, for men. And my aunt? She didn't speak with wisdom. She spoke with fear of her own invisible prison. These whispers from the screen formed a silent chorus, telling me I wasn't crazy, I wasn't bad, I wasn't alone. For the first time since the day my mother closed her eyes, a faint new spark ignited within me. Strength, the anger that had once been my shield and my energy began to cool, giving way to a vast, frightening void. Those whispers confirmed my sanity, but they also destroyed the foundations of my world. The God I loved and feared, the Allah of my father and aunt, was now a distant, unreachable figure. How could I pray to a God whose name was used to justify so much pain? Every prayer, every memorized verse, seemed stained, like a beautiful carpet, but one full of maggots when viewed up close. I was spiritually homeless, adrift in a cold, silent universe. I left my father's house, but I entered a much larger and lonelier prison, a world without meaning, without direction, without God. The nights were the hardest. Lying on the thin mattress in my room at the shelter, I stared at the ceiling, feeling the emptiness tighten in my chest. It was during one of these long, silent nights that the dream arrived. Not an ordinary dream, forgotten upon waking, but something far more real than life itself. I found myself in an infinite void, with no ground or sky, only a dense darkness that seemed to swallow me whole. I was alone, lost, gripped by a cold, primal fear that paralyzed me. I tried to call out for my mother, for someone, but no sound came out. I was like an invisible shadow, a voice that could not be heard in that immense, hostile nothingness. The despair was total. Suddenly a light appeared, not a blindingly bright light, but a soft, welcoming glow that slowly grew in the distance. As it approached, I realized it was coming from a figure, a man walking toward me. He was dressed in a simple, clean white robe. His face was blurred, but it conveyed a profound peace, a calm that seemed to dispel the darkness around him. There was no authority in his posture, no imposition, just a quiet kindness. When he came close, he didn't speak, just looked at me. And in his eyes I found everything I'd ever wanted. Unconditional acceptance, genuine love, an understanding that saw every shattered piece of me, without judgment. He raised his hand, not to command, but with an open palm, offering something invisible. A wave of pure, immense love enveloped me, so strong it brought me to my knees. It was a love that asked nothing in return, demanded neither obedience nor sacrifice. It simply existed, filling the emptiness within me, healing old wounds I hadn't even known still bled, and whispering that I had never truly been alone. I woke with tears streaming down my face, but they weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of relief so overwhelming it seemed impossible to explain. The sterile air of my room seemed to have transformed into something sacred. The peace of that dream lingered with me, like a warm blanket enveloping my soul. I didn't yet know the name of the man in my dream, but as the gray light of an ordinary Manchester morning filled the room, a simple, powerful question blossomed in my heart, bringing a hope I'd never felt before. "Who are you?" That question wouldn't leave me. The peace I'd felt in the dream still glowed, a faint but constant flame in the center of my chest. It was a strange, fragile warmth, and at the same time, a consuming restlessness. The question became my first thought upon waking, and my last before falling asleep. All my life, I'd known Jesus as Isa, a significant prophet, a respected messenger of Allah. But the man in my dream didn't seem just a messenger. He was the message itself. The presence I felt, the love that washed over me, didn't fit with the way I'd learned. I needed to understand. I needed to encounter him again, but not in dreams. This time, in the light of day. After days of silently battling fear, I finally summoned the courage to talk to Sarah. I found her in her cluttered office, sipping coffee, and stood in the doorway, tugging at the hem of my sleeve, waiting for her to notice me. "Sarah," I began, my voice barely above a whisper, "could you give me a Bible?" I expected judgment, surprise, perhaps even rejection, but she just smiled, a gentle smile, as if I'd asked for a blanket on a cold night. "Sure, Ila," she replied simply. "I'll get you one this afternoon." There was nothing but acceptance there. It was an unexpected gift that gave me the strength to take that scary step. That night, a small blue-covered book sat on my desk. I stared at it for what seemed like an eternity. Opening that Bible felt like the ultimate act of betrayal, as if I were crossing a line from which there was no return. My hands were shaking when I finally picked up the book. Following Sarah's note, I skipped the difficult pages at the beginning and opened to the Gospel of Matthew. I began reading, and slowly, the world around me faded away. It wasn't the voice I knew. The God of the Quran, my father's God, was a ruthless authority figure whose love seemed dependent on my perfect obedience. He was a distant, powerful, and demanding master. But there, in those words, the voice was different. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Comfort for those who mourn. A place in the kingdom for those who feel empty. I was both. I continued reading, absorbing each word as if it were a breath of life. I saw that man, Jesus, touching lepers, dining with tax collectors, talking to a Samaritan woman at the well, things no respectable person would do. He wasn't a distant leader on a high throne. He was there, on the ground, with the oppressed, the forgotten, the unwanted. The words my father had repeated, submission, fear, blind obedience, began to be replaced by others, grace, mercy, forgiveness. I came to a passage where Jesus spoke of God not as a rigid and distant king, but as a father, an Abba, a papa, intimate, loving, and close. For me, the word father had always been a burden, a source of fear and rejection. But there, Jesus was reclaiming that word, removing its terror, and shaping it with pure, unconditional love. It was as if a key had turned a hidden lock within me, opening a door I hadn't even known existed. When I read, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest," I couldn't hold back the tears. The man in my dream wasn't just offering a gesture of peace. He was making a promise. The peace I'd felt wasn't just a dream. It was real. It was written there in ink and paper, available to anyone who was weary and broken enough to accept it. The whispers I found online told me I wasn't alone in my pain. The words in that little blue Bible told me I wasn't alone in the universe. In the silence of my shelter room, I read for hours, and Jesus emerged from those pages, entering my heart. His words were a balm for the open wounds I'd carried for years. The peace he offered wasn't a prize for perfection. It was a gift for those who were broken, and I was. But my faith in those early days was solitary, a silent conversation between me and God, inside that cold room. I had found a new home, but I was its only resident. The human heart was not made for this loneliness. I felt an enormous hunger for belonging, for a family that could replace the one I'd lost. Once again, I turned to Sarah. I didn't know how to tell her about the dream, nor how to explain what was happening to me, so I kept it simple. "Sarah," I asked one day, "do you know of a quiet church? Something simple I could go to?" An understanding shone in her eyes that went beyond her usual kindness. She didn't question me or press me for details. She just told me about a place called Grace Community Fellowship. "It's not a giant, imposing cathedral," she said. "It's just a group of ordinary people. I think you might like it." The next morning, walking to that renovated warehouse was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Every instinct screamed at me to run. This was the other side, the world I'd been taught to distrust. I sat on the bench in the back, my heart pounding, my body tensed, ready to flee. But the music wasn't intimidating. It was soft, with simple words about love and grace. People smiled, but they didn't look at me. The pastor, a kind-faced man named David, spoke as if he were chatting with old friends. He spoke of God's relentless love, of a hope that shines in the darkness. It was everything I'd been reading, now spoken aloud, and I felt like I was coming home. I kept coming back. Week after week, I thawed. I learned people's names, shared a cup of tea, allowed them to see me. One Sunday, I attended a baptism. I saw a young man standing in a shallow pool, his voice trembling, describing how his life had changed. I watched Pastor David gently lower him into the water and raise him again, his face radiant, as the congregation applauded and cheered. In that moment, I understood this was more than a ritual. It was a line in the sand, the funeral of an old life and the birth of a new one. I knew, with a certainty that mixed fear and emotion, that I needed to do the same. On the day of my baptism, my heart fluttered wildly, like a hummingbird in my chest. Standing in the warm water, wearing a simple white robe, I looked at the faces of my new family. Sarah was there, smiling in the front row. With Pastor David's encouragement, I spoke a few words, my voice trembling. I didn't share the dark details, but I spoke of being lost and found, of exchanging a life of fear for a life of love. Then David placed his firm hand on my back and said, "Laya, I baptize you now, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." As I plunged into the water, the weight of a lifetime crushed me. My father's cold eyes, my aunt's betrayal, the silence of my old home. But when I emerged, gasping for breath and heading toward the light, it all dissolved, washed away. The sound of applause and shouts of joy enveloped me, and as people I barely knew wrapped me in towels and hugs, I cried, not the tears of a lonely girl in a shelter, but the cleansing, joyful tears of a daughter finally home. My new life at Grace Community Fellowship was a quiet miracle. For the first time, I learned what it meant to simply be. To be Laya, not an imam's daughter, not a source of shame, not a problem to be solved. I was simply Laya. I got a part-time job at a local library, surrounded by the cozy silence of books. I joined a small group at church, where we drank tea and talked about our lives, struggles, and hopes. The terror that had haunted me for so long subsided, giving way to a landscape of scars, but also to a deep and abiding peace. I had been washed in new waters and could now rest on the shore. But late at night, in the silence of my apartment, I remembered. I remembered the girl huddled on a park bench, convinced she was the only one. And sometimes I still remember the whispers on the screen, that chorus of anonymous women whose stories were my lifeline. They saved me. Their courage lit my way through the darkness. My silence, this safe place I'd built, began to feel too comfortable, but it also began to feel like a betrayal. A betrayal to those still trapped, suffocating in the same darkness from which I was rescued. The peace Jesus gave me was not meant to be hidden away like a private treasure. It was meant to be shared, to be a light for those who still live in the shadows. With a heavy heart, I spoke to Pastor David and Sarah. I told them about the forums, about those nights in the shelter, and the power of a story, of a single voice being heard. They listened patiently, with compassion in their eyes, and that gave me strength. "Laya, your story is powerful," David said gently, "but it's yours. You decide when and how to tell it." Those words were the push I needed. I borrowed a simple camera, propped it on a stack of books in my living room, and pressed record. Looking into that dark lens was like looking at the entire world, but I took a deep breath and spoke. I spoke of the shadow of the minaret, of my mother's sweetness, of the pain of seeing a sacred book become a weapon. I spoke of the silence, the fear, and the whispers that came from a screen and led me to a man dressed in white, and then to a home, a real home. I posted the video with the simple title, Laya's Story, and for a moment, the old panic came, that fear of being seen, of being hunted, of being hated, but it passed, like a cloud that darkens for a second and then moves on. In its place was a quiet peace. I had spoken. My voice was there. It was no longer just mine. The response was a tidal wave. Messages came from all corners, from a teenager in Birmingham, terrified of her own home, from a young woman in Toronto, recently disowned by her family, from a mother in Sweden, who had fled with her children in the middle of the night. They all said the same thing. I thought I was the only one. It was then that I understood. A story alone wasn't enough. They didn't just need to hear a voice. They needed a safe space, a place to land, a hammock-like embrace. And so, with the support of my new church family, Sarah's practical wisdom, and David's generous heart, voices of liberation, we started small, a helpline, a bridge between women and shelters, like the one that took me in. Today, we are a registered institution, a choir of voices that grows every day, a living network of hope for those escaping the prisons of distorted faith and spiritual abuse. I no longer look back in anger. The pain was there, the scars remain, but they have been redeemed. Today, this pain has become a purpose. I'm no longer the girl hiding in the shadow of the minaret. About Laya, and the voice that was once stifled by fear, today, by the grace of God, is a whisper of hope for those who still live in silence.